The lecture hall at Stanford University buzzed with a quiet energy. Rows of students, some leaning back lazily, others hastily jotting down notes, sat in various states of engagement, some genuinely interested, others merely feigning attention. Professor Aaron Whitman paced before the whiteboard, his voice sharp and deliberate, carrying the kind of authority that commanded focus. "This," he declared, tapping his marker against a dense equation, "is what separates brilliance from mediocrity." His gaze swept the room as he let the moment linger. "Some of you will grasp it effortlessly," he continued, pausing for effect. "Others," a smirk played at his lips. "Well, let's just say, some of you might want to reconsider your career choices." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the hall, whether out of amusement or self-preservation was unclear. Whitman's reputation preceded him. His intellect was undeniable, a Harvard-trained mathematician with a string of groundbreaking publications. He thrived on pushing the limits of advanced calculus, but his mind was as sharp as his ego was inflated. Admiration wasn't just expected, it was demanded. He had little patience for intellectual shortcomings, and his students knew it. If someone asked a question he deemed too simple, he wouldn't just answer. It became a spectacle. Dismantling a student's confidence for the sake of his own superiority was practically part of the curriculum. Today was no different. Snapping the cap onto his marker, he turned toward the class. "Mathematics is a language," he said. "Either you speak it fluently, or you stumble through it like a lost tourist clutching a phrasebook. There is no in-between." Students exchanged uneasy glances. It was classic Whitman. Near the back, a man sat quietly. He wasn't hunched over a laptop or idly scrolling through his phone like many of the undergrads. He simply observed. He didn't fit in, the graying stubble, the way he carried himself, not slouched like a student, yet not rigid like a professor. Something about him was different, but no one paid him much mind. The class moved on. Whitman scribbled another complex equation on the board before calling on a student. A nervous freshman hesitated, stumbling through an answer. Whitman sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "Anyone else?" he asked, surveying the room. "Or have I overestimated this group?" Silence. His smirk deepened. "I thought so." Then a shift. A faint creak of a chair. The slightest movement from the back of the room. Whitman's eyes flicked toward the source, the man who had gone unnoticed until now. For the first time, he registered his presence. Something about him unsettled Whitman, the quiet confidence, the way he sat like he belonged, yet didn't. Straightening his posture, Whitman addressed him. "Sir," he said, his tone laced with condescension, "I don't believe I've seen you in this class before." The man met his gaze, calm, unfazed, unreadable. "That's because I'm not in this class," he replied, his voice gravelly and even. A few students turned, intrigued. Whitman crossed his arms. "Then what exactly are you doing here?" The man gave a casual shrug. "Just listening." Something about that answer didn't sit well with Whitman. A stranger. Someone who didn't belong, yet sat there like he did. Watching. Observing. As if this lecture was some public spectacle for his entertainment. Whitman wasn't about to let that slide. He stepped forward, narrowing the distance. "Listening, huh?" His smirk sharpened. "Well, let's hope you can keep up." Whoever this man was, he clearly had no idea what he was walking into. That was about to change. A soft murmur spread through the hall. Students shifted, sensing the tension. It wasn't every day that a complete outsider strolled into an advanced calculus class and planted himself in the middle of a lecture. Yet that's exactly what this man had done. Professor Whitman examined him, eyes narrowing slightly. Older, worn but not weak, not hesitant. If anything, the man seemed grounded, like someone with nothing to prove. And that, more than anything, irritated Whitman. Clearing his throat, he raised a brow. "Well, since you're taking up a seat, might as well introduce yourself." The man leaned back, unbothered, as if debating whether the question was even worth answering. Then, with the faintest smirk, he spoke. "Clint." A pause. "Clint Eastwood." Silence. Just for a second. The air shifted. A few students blinked, recognition dawning. Others frowned, exchanging uncertain glances. Had they heard that right? Clint Eastwood? It sounded absurd. Unreal. What would a Hollywood legend, a man famous for westerns and gritty thrillers, be doing here in a Stanford calculus lecture? Whitman, however, barely reacted. If he recognized the name, he gave no indication. Instead, he smirked. "Well, Clint," his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I hope you're enjoying the show." A few chuckles broke the silence, nervous, uncertain. Unfortunately, this isn't some low-budget film set where you can just sit around looking tough, Whitman continued. In here, we deal with real knowledge. The jab hung in the air. But Clint, he didn't flinch. He simply gave a slow nod. Real knowledge, huh? Whitman turned back to the board, rolling up his sleeves. That's right, he said. You see, in this room, intelligence isn't about bravado or reputation. He tapped his temple. It's about what's up here. Then, glancing at the class, his smirk widened. Since we have a distinguished guest, he announced, grabbing a fresh marker, let's have a little fun, shall we? Something about the moment felt wrong. A few students exchanged uneasy looks. Not because they doubted Whitman, his brilliance was unquestioned, but because they had seen this play out before. It was his routine, his ritual. Find someone, some unprepared student, a hesitant freshman, anyone who seemed out of place, and set a trap, not to educate, but to embarrass. Now he had his next target. Turning to the whiteboard, Whitman quickly began sketching an intricate, complex equation. Symbols layered over symbols. Variables tangled together, twisting the problem into something nearly unrecognizable. Then, with a final flourish, Whitman snapped the cap onto his marker and took a step back. His gaze flicked toward Clint. Since you're so keen on listening, he said, voice edged with challenge, why don't you come up here and show us what you've learned? The tension in the room thickened. A few students inhaled sharply. Some straightened in their seats, suddenly more alert. Even those who had barely noticed the exchange before were now watching, captivated. This was Whitman's signature move, a public test, a stage he controlled completely. Yet Clint's reaction wasn't what anyone expected. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Instead, he exhaled softly, rose from his seat, and without a word, strode toward the front of the room. Whitman's smirk deepened, but the students, they weren't so sure anymore. Because something about the way Clint moved suggested this wasn't going to end the way Whitman thought it would. A hush settled over the hall. All eyes locked on Clint Eastwood as he made his way to the whiteboard. His steps were unhurried but deliberate. Not cocky, not rushed. Just steady, like a man who had stepped into more than a few high-stakes encounters in his time. A few students held their breath. Others leaned forward, notebooks forgotten. They all knew how this was supposed to play out. Whitman had done it before, set the bait, let arrogance and nerves unravel his target. The problem on the board was a monster. Even the brightest students would struggle. It wasn't designed to be solved. It was designed to intimidate, to break confidence. Clint stopped in front of the board. Didn't even really study the equation. His expression remained unreadable. No hint of uncertainty. No reaction at all. Whitman crossed his arms. Take your time, he drawled, his tone laced with amusement. Wouldn't want to rush greatness. A few chuckles scattered through the room, brief, uneasy. But they faded fast, because Clint didn't hesitate. He picked up the marker, tapped it against the board, once. Just once. Then, without a second of pause, he started writing. No fumbling. No stopping to think. Just motion. His hand moved fluidly, numbers and symbols forming in clean, confident strokes. The whispers in the room died. The space that had buzzed with murmurs now felt like it was holding its breath. At first, Whitman's smirk held. He was waiting for the inevitable misstep. Whitman waited for the telltale sign, the slip-up that would expose Clint as out of his depth. Maybe a careless algebra mistake. A small miscalculation. Something, anything, that would let the students laugh and allow him to reclaim control of the moment. But then, something shifted. Clint wasn't just solving the equation. He was refining it. He skipped redundant steps, slicing straight to the heart of the problem, solving it with a precision that was more than just correct, it was elegant. His hand didn't waver, didn't second-guess. Every mark he made was deliberate, confident. That's when the first flicker of doubt flashed across Whitman's face. The students noticed. The air in the room grew heavier. A sophomore in the second row murmured, "Wait, is he actually solving it?" Another leaned in, eyes locked on the board. Not just solving it, he's doing it fast. By the time Clint capped the marker and stepped back, the entire lecture hall had fallen silent. The whiteboard, once a battlefield, now stood covered in an answer so precise, so undeniably correct, that there was no room for argument. Clint turned to Whitman, marker still in hand, and with the same quiet confidence asked, "That what you were looking for?" Whitman's face froze. He blinked. Once. Twice. His lips parted slightly, like his mind hadn't caught up to what had just happened. This wasn't just unexpected. This was impossible. And yet, here they were. The silence in the room wasn't just still, it was weighted. The kind of quiet that makes people shift in their seats, hesitant to disturb whatever they had just witnessed. Whitman's signature smirk had vanished. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He glanced at the board, then at Clint, then back at the board, as if, by some miracle, the answer might change if he just looked at it enough times. But it wouldn't, because Clint Eastwood had just solved it. Perfectly. Effortlessly. The students weren't laughing anymore. No nervous chuckles. No exchanged glances of sarcasm. Some were staring wide-eyed at the solution on the board. Others were fixated on Clint himself, trying to reconcile the Hollywood legend standing before them with the raw mathematical genius they had just witnessed. Clint, however, remained utterly unfazed. He set the marker down on the ledge beneath the board, dusted off his hands as if he'd just finished a simple task, and turned back to Whitman. The professor swallowed. His throat bobbed as he tried to regain his composure, but his face had lost some of its color. And despite his best efforts, the undeniable glint of shock remained. Clint tilted his head. Something wrong. Whitman's expression snapped back into place, hardening. That, he gestured toward the board, his voice clipped. That was a fluke. The words felt forced. Some students picked up on it. Clint didn't so much as blink. Fluke, huh? He turned slightly, giving the equation another glance. Looks right to me. What do you think? And that was the moment Whitman realized something far worse than being proven wrong. The students weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Clint. The authority, the presence in the room, had shifted. At the start of class, Whitman had been the undisputed intellectual force in this space. But now, the eyes that once hung on his every word were searching Clint for answers instead. That wasn't something Whitman could allow. All right then, he said, voice sharp, pushing past the lump in his throat. If you're so confident, let's take a look at your work. He grabbed the marker and stepped toward the board, forcing his posture back into control. But as his gaze scanned Clint's solution, his forehead creased. His jaw tightened. His pace slowed. Because the more he studied it, the more he realized Clint's solution wasn't just correct. It was better than the one Whitman himself had prepared. The steps were cleaner, more efficient. Every unnecessary calculation stripped away, leaving only the purest, most direct path to the answer. And if Whitman was being honest, it was beautiful. That realization sent a cold weight sinking into his stomach. He couldn't admit it. Not in front of his students. Not in front of him. So instead, he stalled. Well, he said, dragging the word out. There's nothing wrong exactly, but... Clint raised an eyebrow. But... Whitman hesitated. He had nothing. No errors to call out. No weak points to exploit. Nothing. Clint knew it. The students knew it. And worst of all, Whitman knew it too. The tension shifted again. A whisper from a second row. Did he just check his work? Another murmur followed, and found nothing wrong. Whitman's ears burned. His grip on the marker tightened, his knuckles whitening. He needed a way out, some excuse, some way to save face. But before he could even try, Clint gave him one. A small nod, barely noticeable. A gesture that said, I could push this further. But I won't. He didn't need to. The damage was already done. And Whitman knew it. His jaw clenched so tight that a vein pulsed in his temple. The silence stretched, too long, too heavy. The students weren't looking at him like they used to. No admiration. No intimidation. Just curiosity. For years, he had commanded this room. His word was law. His presence overwhelming. But now they were all waiting for Clint Eastwood's reaction. And that was unacceptable. Whitman forced a chuckle. Tight. Rehearsed. Well, he said, stepping back, feigning amusement. I suppose even a broken clock is right twice a day. He tried to play it off. Tried to make it seem like it wasn't a big deal. But nobody laughed. The students weren't stupid. They saw the hesitation in his voice. The slight twitch in his hands. They saw what he saw. Clint Eastwood had humiliated him. Without even trying. And Clint, he was calm. Hands in his pockets. Stance relaxed. No gloating. No smirk. Just waiting. Which somehow made it even worse. Whitman cleared his throat, forcing his voice into something resembling authority. Tell me, Clint, he said, you a mathematician in another life? Clint shrugged. Not exactly. Whitman scoffed. Then how'd you pull that off? Clint glanced at the board. Then back at Whitman. You ever heard of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz? Whitman blinked. What? Clint stepped closer. Leibniz. One of the fathers of calculus. Brilliant guy. You know what he said? Whitman hesitated. Clint gave him a small, knowing look. He said, "It is easier to be wise for others than for oneself." A few students exhaled sharply. Some exchanged looks, piecing it together. Clint wasn't just throwing out some random historical quote. He was talking about Whitman. Whitman's lips thinned. "Cute," he muttered. Clint ignored the jab. "Thing is, Professor, I don't have a fancy degree like you. Never needed one. But I've always liked numbers." His gaze flicked back to the board, like the way they tell the truth, no matter who's looking at them. A beat of silence. And truth is, that problem was a lot simpler than you made it out to be. A few students stifled their grins. Whitman's ears burned hotter. His voice came out tight. "And I suppose you think you're smarter than me?" Clint shook his head. "Not at all." A pause. "Just saying, sometimes the smartest guys in the room get so caught up trying to sound brilliant." His eyes met Whitman's. "That they forget to just be right." The final blow landed. It wasn't loud. Wasn't dramatic. But it cut deep. Whitman's face hardened. He opened his mouth, probably to fire back, to regain some semblance of control. But nothing came out. Because what could he say? Clint had already won. And everyone knew it. The weight of his words hung in the air. Not forced. Not loud. Just the kind of truth that didn't need repeating. Whitman stood frozen, marker still clutched in his hand like a weapon he never got the chance to use. No one moved. No one dared to break the moment. Then, slowly, the tide started to shift. It began with a single student. A quiet nod of respect. Then another. Then a ripple spread through the room. The students weren't looking at Whitman anymore. They were looking at Clint. Not as an actor. Not as a celebrity. But as something more. Someone who had walked into their world. Into their professor's carefully controlled domain. And flipped the script. Without bragging. Without needing to tear anyone down. Whitman must have felt it too. The shift. The loss of control. Because suddenly he needed to move. He turned sharply, slamming the marker onto his desk. "Well," he snapped, voice tight. "Since we've had our little theatrical intermission, maybe we can get back to something productive." Some students shifted awkwardly. A few exchanged glances. Half amused. Half incredulous. But Clint just smiled. Not a smirk. Not a sneer. Just that same steady, knowing look. He gave a single nod. Then turned toward the door. And that's when it happened. It was small at first. Barely noticeable. A slow clap. One student. Then another. Then a third. Then the sound built. Not loud. Not over the top. Just genuine. A quiet show of respect. Whitman's face twisted. He didn't tell them to stop. Didn't call for order. He just stood there. Because what was there to say? By the time Clint reached the door, he paused. Just for a moment. Glanced back over his shoulder. Not to gloat. Not to rub it in. Just to leave one last thought hanging in the air. "Smart guy like you, Professor," Clint said, voice calm, easy. "You might want to start listening more than you talk." And with that, he walked out. Leaving Whitman standing there. Leaving the students staring, wide-eyed. Leaving behind a moment they wouldn't forget. Because sometimes, the smartest guy in the room isn't the loudest one. The door clicked shut. But the weight of Clint's words still lingered. Professor Whitman didn't move. His room, his domain, felt different now. The power he had walked in with, the control he had always commanded. Gone. Not taken forcefully. Not wrestled away. Just gone. And the worst part, Clint hadn't even tried. The students, sensing something unspoken still hung in the air, remained quiet. A few still stared at the board, at the flawless solution Clint had left behind. Others sat back, their expressions unreadable. Because they had just witnessed something rare. This wasn't just about math. It wasn't even about Clint Eastwood. It was about ego. About assumptions. About the idea that intelligence and wisdom belonged only to those who sat behind podiums, who were titles, who controlled the conversation. Whitman had spent years believing that. And in less than 5 minutes, Clint had proven him wrong. The professor's throat tightened. He turned to erase the board. But then, he stopped. He stared at the numbers. The logic. The truth. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar. Not anger. Not humiliation. Just humility. It was subtle. Almost imperceptible. But it was there. Instead of erasing Clint's work, Whitman stepped back. And left it there. The students noticed. A few exchanged glances, surprised. But no one said a word. Because the lesson had already been taught. A lesson about real intelligence. About how sometimes the loudest voice in the room isn't the one worth listening to. about how true wisdom isn't about proving you're the smartest. It's about knowing when you aren't. And that is something even the most educated minds still struggle to learn. So if there's one thing to take from this, it's this. Never assume you know everything. Because the moment you do, someone out there, maybe someone you least expect, is ready to remind you just how much you still have to learn. So whether you're in a classroom, at work, or anywhere else in life, stay sharp, stay humble, because you never know who's watching, and who just might be smarter than you think. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more like it. And hey, next time someone underestimates you, remember, the best way to win is to let the truth speak for itself.